Four brands, one young athlete, and a decision that seemed safe, but ended up changing marketing, sports, and business forever. In 1984, inside a closed room, people believed they were making the right decision, when in reality, they were defining the future. Some thought they already had their stars. Others felt too big to take risks. Some believed it wasn't their moment. And only one saw something different. Not just a bet. Not just a risk. They saw a star. This is not a story about sports. Not even a story about brands. This is a story about vision, about fear, and about what happens when you stand in front of a decision that you don't make, or that you do. And from that moment, nothing was ever the same. To understand how a single decision can change everything, we first need to understand the world before it happened. In the early 1980s, the world lived between tension and hope. The Cold War divided nations. Markets grew more aggressive, and television was reshaping the way people saw reality. People no longer followed only political leaders. They began to follow idols, musicians, actors, athletes. Sports were starting to become more than competition. They were becoming entertainment. There were already important figures in sports, but the athlete was not the brand. The brand was the power. The athlete was just the face that wore it. And while the world was changing, the major sports brands lived very different realities. Some dominated the market and felt comfortable. Others were strong, but slow. And one of them was barely surviving, trying to find its place in an industry that did not belong to it. Everything followed known rules. Everything felt stable. Everything seemed safe. And then, in the middle of that world, a young man appeared. A young man who was still nobody. Basketball in the early 1980s was beginning to become more than just a sport. It was becoming a spectacle. The NBA started filling arenas, signing television deals, creating figures that people followed, like idols. Two names dominated the conversation: Magic and Larry. Their rivalry didn't just define games, it defined an era. And there was one brand that ruled that world: Converse. They had the stars, they had the credibility, they had control. For them, risk was not an opportunity, it was a threat. Meanwhile, other brands watched the world from a different height. Adidas dominated football, dominated the tracks, dominated international stages. Basketball was not their priority. They saw it as interesting, but not essential. Reebok, on the other hand, was looking in a different direction. The fitness world was exploding. Gyms were filling up. Exercise was becoming a lifestyle. Reebok wasn't looking for a court. It was looking for a mirror in front of a treadmill. And then, there was the last one: Nike. No dominance, no legacy, no security, nothing to lose. While some brands defended their thrones, others ignored them, and others built their own world. One was waiting for an opportunity to change the rules. In 1984, signing a young athlete was still not a safe move. It was still a bet. Brands were not looking for the future. They were looking for the present. Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Faces already known, icons already established. Betting on someone new was not just risky. It could look like madness. But this young athlete was not completely invisible. Years earlier, in a college championship game, with everything against him, he had taken the final shot, and he made it. Millions watched. His name was not yet a brand. but his face had already appeared on televisions across the country. Then came the 1984 Olympic Games. Once again, the lights. Once again, the cameras. Once again, the world watching. And it wasn't his size that caught attention. It was his style. While others played with power, he played with speed, with creativity, with air. Basketball was the perfect stage. Fast, visual, televised. Sneakers were not just equipment. They were part of the show. But the business was still conservative. At that time, rookie contracts were simple. $50,000 a year, maybe $100,000. No ownership, no long-term vision, nothing that could put a company at risk. But this time, something was different. It was not just about sponsorship. It was about building a brand around a single person. And that kind of decision no one had made before. While he dreamed of a brand he admired since childhood, the brands began to ask themselves if they were ready to bet on someone who didn't ask for permission. And in that moment, the opportunity stopped being theoretical. It became real. The brands were not looking at the same board. Converse believed in the gods of the game, in names already carved into history. Julius Erving, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird. Their vision was clear. Basketball belonged to the giants, to the established, to those who had nothing to prove. Adidas looked at the game through a different logic. They looked for height, presence, physical dominance. For them, the future of basketball was above 7 feet tall. Reebok was playing a different game. They weren't thinking about courts. They were thinking about gyms, fitness, lifestyle. And while everyone was looking in different directions, one brand decided to stare into the void. Nike. Their usual strategy was simple. Spread the risk. 3 contracts, 3 rookies. Do not bet everything. But this time, someone inside Nike decided to break that rule. To bet everything. One name, one single bet. He was willing to risk his career for it. And the name was Michael Jordan. He was not a legend. Not yet. He was a question, a bet, a risk. And the clock started to run. The day of the 1984 NBA draft was getting closer, and the time to decide was running out. While the clock was running and the deadline was getting closer, each side was living the pressure in a different way. Converse did not feel threatened. They had their gods, Magic, Larry, Dr. J. The throne felt safe. Adidas, on their side, felt calm. They were not just looking for height. They were not just looking for physical dominance. They also believed they had something even more important: the preference of the young athlete. He wanted Adidas. That was public. They saw no urgency. They saw no danger. Reebok had already stepped out of the race. Their world was somewhere else, in gyms, in fitness, in lifestyle. But inside Nike, nothing was calm. There were discussions, doubts, and one voice that broke the silence. Sonny Vaccaro didn't see a player. He saw an opportunity no one else wanted to see. "I'm willing to bet my career on him," he said. Meanwhile, far from those offices, there was another room, less elegant, more human. A young man who wanted one thing: to sign with Adidas, and 2 figures around him. His father, silent, firm, protective. A man who believed in hard work and discipline. His mother, calm, observant, strategic. A woman who could see beyond the moment. When he wanted to close the decision, she was the one who said, "Listen to them." It wasn't an order. It was a door. And that door was beginning to change everything. There were no longer four. There were no longer three. Only two remained. Two ways of seeing the future, two philosophies, two silent battles happening at the same time. On one side, Adidas. Elegant, confident, comfortable. They walked into the room convinced of one thing. He already wanted them. Their presentation was clean, correct, professional. They talked about product, about technology, about tradition. They showed him shoes that had worked for others. They didn't talk about changing history. They talked about becoming part of it. From their side, the feeling was simple. We don't need to convince him. We just need to formalize it. But in another part of the city, the atmosphere was completely different. Nike could not afford to lose. They had no plan B, no stars, no thrones, only one opportunity. They walked into the room not with a product, but with a vision. They didn't talk about what the brand was. They talked about what he could become. They showed him something no one had seen before. A sketch, a design, a dangerous idea. Not shoes with his name on them, but a line built around his identity, his last name, printed like a brand. In the back of the room, someone barely spoke. Sonny Vaccaro knew he wasn't just risking this deal, he was risking his career. Meanwhile, on the other side of the table, emotions were not the same. He was still thinking about Adidas. That had always been his dream. His father watched in silence, like a wall. But his mother started to see something no one was saying. She didn't see shoes. She saw respect. She saw possibility. She saw a future that wasn't aligned with tradition, but with transformation. And then, something subtle changed. For the first time, it was no longer a simple decision. For the first time, no one was sure who was winning. And amidst the confusion, one idea began to gain traction. Not the safest, not the most comfortable, the most dangerous. And when the noise subsided, only one proposal continued to resonate in everyone's mind. The decision was made, and the name was clear. Nike. The paper was on the table. It didn't look dangerous, but it was. On paper, the contract seemed normal. A few $1 million, a multi-year deal. Nothing shocking today. But in 1984, it was a wild bet. No one did that. For Nike, one thought was clear. This could save them, or destroy them. They were breaking every rule. They weren't just signing a player. They were giving him something no athlete had ever received. A personal brand, image rights, creative control, a line built around his name. For the first time, an athlete wouldn't just represent a company. He would be the company. But in another building, the view was very different. At Adidas, it looked excessive. Too much money, too much risk. To them, it wasn't a missed opportunity. It was a mistake avoided. They didn't believe in individual idols. They believed in structure, in systems. They didn't see a revolution. They saw danger. And far from the offices, there was a home, silence, a family staring at a piece of paper that could change everything. They didn't come from wealth. They didn't come from privilege. They came from work, from discipline, from care. The father saw the contract as a safety net. The mother saw it as a door. They weren't choosing a brand. They were choosing a future. And no one at that table could imagine what that paper was about to unleash. No one saw the millions of sneakers. No one saw the culture. No one saw the empire. They only saw a risk, a signature, and a name. That was about to become a legend. The story didn't change overnight. It started quietly. A new player on the court. a different pair of shoes, a logo no one fully understood yet. But something felt different. Every time he touched the floor, the world paid a little more attention. Sales broke every prediction. Stores ran out of stock. Waiting lists appeared everywhere. It was no longer just about playing better. It was about belonging, about representing something bigger than the game. The NBA began to change. Cameras arrived before reporters. Games stopped being just games and became global spectacles. The player stopped being just an athlete. He became a symbol, a reference, a culture. For the first time in history, a person was no longer just lending their image to a brand. He became the brand. Marketing stopped revolving around products. It began revolving around identities. While one brand was redefining the game, others watched in silence. Adidas understood too late what had happened. Converse stopped being the center of the universe. Reebok lived its own era, but never controlled the conversation again. These were not mistakes. They were decisions made before understanding the future. And then, something became clear. This was no longer just a sports story. It was no longer just a shoe story. It was a new way of understanding power. Everything had been born from one single thing: a room, a paper, a signature, a decision that changed the world forever. Here are some facts that help explain why this story was so unique. The first logo of the line was not the famous Jumpman. The very first symbol was called Wings, a basketball with wings. The idea came from a Nike executive who believed the brand should represent the dream of flying higher than limits. This design appeared on the earliest Air Jordan models. The iconic Jumpman came later. It was based on a real photograph of Michael Jordan jumping with his legs spread and the ball raised above his head. That image was transformed into a silhouette and became one of the most recognizable logos in history. The first Air Jordan shoes also created controversy. The red and black colorway didn't follow NBA rules at the time. The league fined players who wore shoes that were not mostly white. Nike chose to pay the fines instead of changing the design. What was banned became irresistible, an object of desire. Another important detail: this contract was one of the first to include what we now call real image rights. Jordan didn't just get paid to play. He earned a percentage from every pair sold. And that changed the relationship between brands and athletes forever. About the money, as a player, Jordan earned tens of millions in the NBA. But his independent brand generated billions in sales over the decades. Today, he still earns money from the brand that carries his name, far more than he ever earned on the court. This was not just a sports decision. It was a business decision. And now that you know this story, you may never look at a pair of Air Jordans the same way again. Because this wasn't just a signature, it was a decision. And decisions don't just change careers, they change industries, they change generations, they change the way we understand power. If this video surprised you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves great stories. Because this isn't just a sports channel. This is a channel about decisions that change the world, about choices no one thought were important, about names that weren't chosen first, about talents that didn't look like safe bets, about a player drafted when the cameras were already off, who ended up changing history forever, about a player once dismissed who changed the destiny of a franchise, about someone who seemed too small to change the game. That is a story for our next episode. This is USS.Network, Untold Sports Stories.